The release of Next.js version 10 brought out-of-the-box support for internationalization, which means developers can now build one single application that can be translated into multiple languages based on their region or language. I've had a chance to play around with these features and I found it really impressive, so I've made this video to give you a quick crash course into how you can get started with internationalization in Next.js. So before I jump into the code and show you how to do internationalization with Next.js, I just want to point out that although Next.js as a framework supports internationalization straight out of the box, it doesn't actually handle the implementation of internationalization. And for that, it's suggested that you try out one of these React libraries that are very good for the actual implementation of internationalization within your Next.js application. On the left here, I have a blank Next.js application using Next version 10.0.4, and in order to get started with internationalization, we just need to make a few changes to our Next config file. Since this application doesn't already have a Next config file, I'm just going to go ahead and create one. So we create a new file in the root and we call it next.config.js, and inside here we're going to do module.exports, and that's going to be an object with a property called i18n, which is going to be an object again, with a property called locales, and this is going to be an array of strings. Inside this array, we pass in the regions and the language that we want to internationalize our application for. So for the purpose of this tutorial, we're going to do en-gb and en-us. For those who have worked with internationalization before, immediately you'll realize how powerful this actually is. Next.js out of the box supports internationalization by not only language, but language and region. What that means is that you can also pass in values like FR for French and DE for German without having to specify the region, i.e. Germany. But to keep this tutorial short, sweet and simple, we're just going to stick with en-gb and en-us. It's also recommended that you create a second property called default locale and set this to the default value of translation that you want to use in your Next.js application. For this example, we're going to do en-gb. Now we can hit save and actually run our application using the command npm run dev. And then if we open our browser to localhost port 3000, you'll see the default create next app landing page. Now our challenge for this video is to translate the text welcome to howdy when we're viewing this website for en-us, and to leave it at welcome when we're viewing this website for en-gb. Now that our configuration tells Next.js that our web application is going to be available in en-gb and en-us, we can try this out by adding /en-gb to the base URL of our web application. When we hit enter, you'll notice the same page loads, but this is now explicitly operating in en-gb. If we change the GB to US so that it's en-us, you'll see that again, we get the same page, but it's now explicitly operating in en-us. We can remove this suffix from our URL, and this will still display us en-gb because that's what we've defined as the default locale. So let's jump in and actually do some of the translation. Like I mentioned earlier, we're not going to be using any libraries, just a simple JSON object for our translation strings. And in order to do that, we're going to create a new file and call it translations.js. Inside here, we're going to export a constant called en-us. And this is going to be an object with a single property called welcome, and it's going to translate to howdy. We're going to export a second constant from the same file. It's going to be called en-gb. And we're going to have a single property again, but this is going to translate to welcome. The next step is to head over to our index.js file, which renders this page, and we can verify that by just making a change here. So 2 exclamation marks. When I hit save, you'll notice that the page on the right has refreshed and now shows the changes reflected in my code. In order to show translated strings based on the locale of the user or the browser, what we need to do is identify what locale they're viewing the website in. We can use the Next.js router for this, and in order to do that, we're going to use the useRouter hook. So define a constant called router and assign that to useRouter, and we need to import this if VS Code doesn't do it automatically. So import useRouter router from next/router. There's no dependencies to install here. It comes pre-bundled with Next.js. And now inside this router object, we will have a property called locale. So we can just destructure it like so and grab that from the router property. Now, if I just change this line of code here to render the value of locale and hit save, you'll see that it will tell us that we're currently on the ENGB version of the web application, and there's nothing in the URL here, so it's the default version that's correct. If we now go to en-gb, it should render the same thing again, ENGB, because now we're explicitly telling Next.js to render the English UK version of the website. If we change this to en-us, you'll notice that the locale here has now changed to en-us. If we were to try and render a locale that we have not defined in our next config file, for example, FR for French, we'll get the default 404 page. Now, it's a bit of a pain to expect our users to have to manually redirect to the version of the website that they want to view. It'd be nice if there'd usually be some sort of toggle or drop down where they can select the language. To keep things simple, what we're going to do is every time the user clicks on the locale text here, it will automatically instruct Next.js to toggle the language of our web application. In order to do that, we're going to create an onClick property here on our p tag, and we're just going to create a function called handle language toggle, and then we just need to declare that function up here. So const handle language toggle equals, we're not going to pass any arguments into our function, and this function is simply going to switch on the locale property that we have a few lines up, and there's going to be two cases. It can either be en-gb, the default, and something will happen, and then we'll break out of the switch statement. We'll come back to the implementation in a second. And the second case is it could be en-us, and we'll do something, and then we'll break out from the switch statement. So if the user is currently in the UK version of the website or the default version, we want to switch them over to the US version. To do this, we can again use the Next.js router. So we'll do router.push, and anyone that's used Next.js before will be familiar that this is how you navigate between pages. And this takes the first argument, which is going to be a string of the URL that we want to go to. We want them to remain on the home page, so we'll just do a /. There's a second optional property. Now, you can just set this to whatever you set the first property as. It doesn't matter at this point. And the third argument is actually an object of options. And here we're going to pass in a value for locale, and we're going to tell it which locale we now want to re-render the page in. So if they're currently in ENGB, we want them to go to EN-US. We can now copy this line of code and paste it under the second case for the switch statement, and just switch out EN-US for ENGB, and then hit save. At the moment, nothing is actually going to happen because we haven't implemented our translation strings. So in order to do that, we just want to import them from this translations file that we created earlier. So we'll just do import, and then we're going to import EN-US and ENGB from that file, translations, like so. And let's create a variable within our home component. Let's just call it T for simplicity. And this value is going to be assigned one or the other of the translation strings depending on the locale. So to do this, we can do locale equals ENGB. If that is the case, then we want T to equal ENGB. Else, we want it to equal EN-US. We can then implement our translation string, so we can replace the word welcome with t.welcome. So now when the user is on the GB version of the website, they'll get the translation strings for GB from the translations.js file. And when on the US version of the website, they'll get the US translation strings. So we can try that out. So we have our application here on the right hand side, and we're just going to click the current locale, and that's going to execute handle language toggle, which is the function that we just declared. So if we click that, you'll notice that the translation changes to howdy. We click it again, it goes back to welcome. Now notice when we click and go to EN-US, Next.js automatically updates the URL for us and sets the active locale to EN-US. When we click and go back, Next.js automatically handles the URL routing for us. What's really nice about how Next.js does internationalization is that you'll notice when you toggle between the two, there's no sort of jumping and jittering on the screen. It's nice and smooth, nice and crisp, and nice and responsive, which creates a fantastic user experience. I think it's also worth mentioning how well Next.js implements internationalization for developers because it encapsulates a lot of logic under the hood for us. As an example, if someone was visiting your web application from the US, it would detect and display the appropriate translations to that user. Now we can simulate that in a browser like Microsoft Edge or Chrome by heading into our settings and changing our language preferences. So if we just search for languages here so that we can quickly jump to them and change them. And I'm just going to move English United States to the top instead of English United Kingdom. And then if we try and go back to the default version of our website and refresh this, you'll see that it's automatically redirected to the US version of our website. That's because our browser settings now tell Next.js and our web application that we're visiting from the United States. Now, how does this actually work? Well, if we open the Chrome Developer Tools and then open the Network tab, when we refresh our application, we'll see under this request, under request headers, that the browser is making the request with accept language set to ENUS as the first preference. So Next.js is automatically picking this up for us and then responding with the content that the client is asking for without us, the developer, having to do any work whatsoever. If I change the language settings back to English United Kingdom as my first preference, and now if I refresh the application on the default URL, you notice that it doesn't redirect me to the ENUS version of the website. Again, this is because if we look at the latest request in the Network tab, our browser is making the request with the accept language header set to ENGB as the first preference. So I hope that gives you a quick but very thorough introduction into how you can implement internationalization in your Next.js application.